We got another one of them. Popping at the mouth or the side of his neck when he pouts. No argument, no rebuttal from. He ain't from my town, I don't know him, so I'm guessing he's a clown.
Hey, welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. So, a lot of people have been talking a lot lately about why wrestling doesn't draw. Why isn't it as, big as it used to be? Why isn't it a pop culture sensation as it used to be? And there's a lot of reasons for it. But I think you can track one of the reasons is to the kinds of people that they've pushed. In recent years, for the most part, WWE, with the exception of Lashley and McIntyre, Roman, and guys like that, and Brock, they have started to move more towards the everyman. Your Kevin Owens, your in NXT, Adam Cole, or Johnny Gargano, or your Daniel Bryans, your CM Punks, your AJ Styles, those guys, right? They're more technically proficient. They, in some cases, they may even have better personalities, but they don't capture the imagination like the bigger dudes do, And that's pretty much the long and the short of it. But when you look at it from a cultural perspective, because wrestling is a cultural thing, it started to change around the time you started to see changes in the action movies, right? Now, before we start talking about action movies, you have to understand that not every action movie was the same. There were action stars, that were more technically proficient. Your Bruce Lees, your Kung Fu stars, your Jackie Chan's, your Jet Lees, those guys, right? And those guys are good. They have a lane. There's a lane for the Kung Fu star, the martial arts epic of guys with swords, guys with fists, and they do their thing. It's beautiful. It's great. I love it. Then you have your hard-boiled detective, or your what they will call maybe your almost Western type of guy in a more modern setting, your Clint Eastwoods and your Charles Bronsons, right? Your no-nonsense dads, your no-nonsense detectives that were going out there to fight terrorists and all that kind of stuff. Your Bruce Willis, those kind of guys, right? They get a gun, they go out there and handle the problem, but they're not huge, muscular guys. They're more attitude guys. That's your Stone Cold Steve Austins, your Stone Cold Steve Austin's more of a Clint Eastwood, more of a Bruce Willis, that kind of star. And those guys go on to be huge cultural icons like Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson, But what everybody grew up on is the gigantic 80s action star. Your Sylvester Stallone, your fucking Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm talking gigantic arms, barely speaks English, but will kill everything in sight, was a complete and total badass. And it doesn't matter what movie you put Arnold in, people were going to see it. And that culture is what birthed Hulk Hogan. It's what birthed the Ultimate Warrior. Later, it's the same seat Goldberg was sitting in, and even to a degree, Sid Vicious, But when you started to see Arnold slow down, you started to see Sylvester Stallone slow down, you started to see them kind of recede on the Hogans. You started to see them kind of recede on the Ultimate Warrior didn't get much of a run. But you started to see them kind of slow down on those guys. And they started moving more towards, other types of guys, your Shawn Michaels, your Bret Harts, your stuff like that. And in recent years, it has gone to the extreme with goddamn cruiserweights being world champions, or Rey Mysterio's, for instance. I'm sure he has some bulk to him now, but he's still 5'4". Like, you can't unsee that, like you can't unsee that he's small as hell. And that's kind of how, action movies have become, where you can't unsee that some of these guys are not physically imposing. And then they're taking it to the next level by, in the 80s, there used to be, we didn't know how large Arnold was. Like, we knew he was a big dude, but we used to see him shredded. We see his arms out in every movie that he was in. For some reason, his arms were out. And same thing with Sylvester Stallone. Like, when you go watch Rambo, you would see that Sylvester Stallone was in tremendous shape. He looked like a man who would murder 100 people. And people believed it. And you would go watch the movie and he would literally kill 100 people. And it was perfectly fine. And I'm like, I approve. I approve of this. But then in later years, You started seeing more John Wicks. That's one of the bigger action movie franchises. And look, there's nothing wrong with John Wick. I liked the first one. I didn't see the other two. You started seeing Jason Statham. You started even seeing 50-year-old Denzel Washington do action movies. And the interesting thing about this is they all were covered up. You never got to see their strength. Like when you see Rambo or Predator or some of those type of movies, part of the popularity of it was those guys were, it was just man and gun or his fists or a knife or something like that. He didn't have a lot of gadgets. He didn't have any superpowers. He would just go out there and through force and will and brute strength beat the shit out of whatever needed shit beaten out of it, you know? And people were attracted to that. People were attracted to that masculine energy, that hyper competence, hyper violence to a degree. And even you had Jean-Claude Van Damme in that case too. So you started having those guys, they started to wane. And you started to see them wane also in wrestling. And now you do have your wrestling versions of John Wick, your Kenny Omegas, the guys who can have very stylized, choreographed fight scenes, but they're not impressive physically at all. So it's difficult for people to buy it. It's difficult for people to believe in it. And unlike wrestling, like wrestling hasn't followed Hollywood completely, because Hollywood fell off and they started putting all the action stars in full body suits. Iron Man wears a suit of armor. Spider-Man, Captain America, all these guys are wearing suits. So you can't really see the strength. Like seeing the strength is as important as knowing that they have it. Because now everybody has superpowers. So you don't need a gun anymore. Hollywood has a thing about guns. If you have a gun in a movie, like when The Punisher came out. And The Punisher is a good example of a character that you can see that change in. Because The Punisher, when the original Punisher movies and stuff like that were being produced way back, you started seeing like Dolph Lundgren was supposed to play the Punisher. Dolph Lundgren was a great action star from the 80s. He was Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. And you started seeing that, and then it went from that to Thomas Jane. And Thomas Jane, still had the sort of strength in the arms. A lot of people love this characterization of Frank Castle because he looked more like an 80s action star, which is what the Punisher is. And then you had Barenthal. And Barenthal is not a physically imposing guy. He played the character very well, but he's not physically imposing. And he didn't have the visage of a grizzled military guy, which had been drilled into the brains of people who were born in the 80s and 90s as being a tough, muscular, hard fighting soldier. He killed 100 guys in an alleyway. It looked pretty, it looked brutal, but did we really buy it? People complained the whole time about the movie, or the series, because it was gun happy and gun heavy. And that's part of another reason why Hollywood has started to change. And now we don't have action stars anymore because, back in the day, action stars had guns. It was about big guns and big arms. Now it's about, small guns, thin arms. And now it's getting to the point now where most of the action stars today are just pretty boys in cool suits. And that's not really capturing the imagination of people. And it should come as no surprise that people are attracted to masculinity and the vision of masculinity, which is why they used to make sculptures about, with men in incredible shape, even if it was undesirable shape. You started seeing that, coming out of the Greek cultures, or even seeing it in Africa. You see it all over the place, except for in Asia, where they talked a lot about proficiency, being how to be a good soldier, how to be a good warrior, how to be a good, this, that, and the third. But most societies really emphasized the look of strength supplementing actually being strong, but now in our society today, because we don't really have too many big buff action stars, we got pretty boys in suits. And what brought this on, what made me talk about this, is seeing the trailer for the Eternals, the new Marvel movie. And I looked at it and I was just like, okay, well, you could just tell it's Hollywood it's the change in Hollywood in a nutshell. Just as many women as there are men. All of the men are, everyone's covered up. You can't see anything as far as anything that is unique to them. The idea of a Conan the Barbarian, Predator, Rambo type of male character is not there. They're not present. So you're just sitting here like, okay, it's everybody with superpowers, because everyone has superpowers now, so you don't need to look strong anymore. And you could tell that Marvel was going to go this route with the way that they did the Hulk and the Thing, not the Thing, but the Thor and Endgame, where you had Professor Hulk, where he's big and muscular and green, but he's wearing glasses and he's socially awkward. And Thor is fat and he's crying because his mommy died. And it's, you're kind of like, this is what they think of muscular guys now. They think they're all crybabies, or that they're all really, the real strong guys are the dorks. And that doesn't work. And just like it doesn't work in Hollywood, people are not buying it. Now, people are going to see these movies because, the Marvel movies found a unique way of funding this system by interlocking all of the movies into one grand narrative. That was part of why so many of these movies did well, if we're being honest. Most people don't care about Ant-Man. But Ant-Man did okay because everyone knew it was interlocked in all the other movies. Same thing with like Captain Marvel. Like, these characters don't really matter, but if I have to watch this movie in order to tell what's going on in the other movies, then I have to watch this movie. So you started seeing that kind of thing. But for the most part, you started seeing them start to phase out the action star. And it began a long time ago. It began a long time ago. But it seems like a lot of people just really started noticing it within the last 5 or 10 years. You started seeing a lot of people say, like, what happened to the action star? What happened to the badass? What happened to that guy? And it's like Hollywood slowly but surely phased them out. And, like Wesley Snipes was a badass and he played Blade, right? He was hyper competent. You can see, like, in his arms, he had the action style, He had the martial arts stuff going on, but he still was proficient with weapons. It felt like an 80s action movie, the first Blade. The first 2 Blades, pretty good. But then when they had X-Men, you had Hugh Jackman, who was, ripped to shreds, but, everyone else was pretty much just an average Joe. And then over time, you just kind of started going with average Joes with superpowers. And that was in like, 2002 maybe? You started seeing that, when it came to comic book movies, you didn't need a gigantic, muscular guy. You could just put a dweeb in a suit, like the guy who played Deadpool. Just put a dweeb in a suit, and if he can play the character, then it works. Spider-Man doesn't need to be a big, bulky superhero. He doesn't need to be Arnold Schwarzenegger. So we don't need to push the Arnold Schwarzenegger anymore. Batman doesn't need to be an Arnold Schwarzenegger type. So we don't have to do that anymore. And then when comic book superheroes took over, even with Superman, it became a similar thing. Because Superman is sort of, part of his thing is, even though he's covered up, is his size. Is that Superman is super. He's big. And then they started doing silly stuff like drawing cartoons where Batman is just as big as Superman. Like, that's kind of silly. But you started seeing that they started phasing out the big, larger than life action star. And then you started to see that too in wrestling. You started to see, and then people started to kind of reject it. Now if a guy shows up and he's bigger and larger than life, people started to be like, oh, well, he's just a steroid freak. You started getting those kind of attacks. Or you make sure that he's strong, but he's not too strong. So now he's having problems beating a guy who's 180 pounds, and he's got to chase this guy around for 15 minutes instead of putting the smash on him in 2 or 3 minutes, which is what they would have done in the past. Now you got guys chasing small guys around for 30 minutes or whatever, and that's just kind of how the genre has gone. Where, we don't even, in our modern society, we don't really even have the hard-boiled detective, the badass common guy like Bruce Willis anymore. That would be your Stone Cold Steve Austins. We don't even really have those guys anymore. We have all of the kung fu masters in the world. We got all the choreographed fighters in the world today. Your Ricochets and your Will Ospreys and all those guys. We got 100 million of those guys. They're all interchangeable. Your Adam Coles and your Johnny Garganos. And occasionally we stumble across an action star, a big budget action star who got the look and who's got the appeal. But then they have to deal with living in a world with all of these small choreographed guys who, have to do everything. And that's really that has helped kill Hollywood. Hollywood is finding a different way to make money by doing everybody's got superpowers. And hey, don't you remember this character from the comic books? And wrestling doesn't have that. Wrestling doesn't have that. So they can't follow that, and they shouldn't be following that, but they are. The culture simply has changed, and we don't accept masculinity in look and in practice anymore. One of the crazier things that you noticed is that in comic books, there used to be guys who drank beer and smoked cigarettes because that's what, everybody believed that masculine men did. And some guys still do drink beer and smoke cigarettes and hit the gym. That's used to be another thing you used to see in comic books all the time. Like you go back and read old comic books, you will see like Daredevil working out. He would be in the gym. Now you don't see that stuff anymore. They definitely don't smoke anymore in comic books. They certainly don't drink beer anymore in comic books. And that has started to facilitate into the world now where, everybody's fitness minded, but nobody ever works out, so you're kind of like, I don't know, and you can take these things and change them a little bit. But for the most part, man, the badass is gone, and that sort of visual, the big dude who stands his ground and is willing to take down large mobs of people, that stuff is kind of gone now. And we hold on to it dearly every chance we get. When we get Brock, that's why Brock is so special, because he's the only one who's allowed to go in there and be a giant that smashes 180-pound guys with no problem. They don't let Lashley do it. They don't let Drew McIntyre do it. They let Brock do it, though. Brock is like, look, this guy's 100 pounds. I'm going to throw him around, throw him out of the building, and win. Period. And that's why he gets over. But then on the other hand, you have Brian Cage, do a 25-minute match with a dude who's 150 pounds and lose, and that's why wrestling is having a hard time. And that's just one of the reasons. There's 100 reasons, but that's one. And that's a very important one, is that we don't see the masculine energy anymore. We don't have that masculine character anymore. It's gone. It's been taken. It's been gutted from the culture. People don't support it anymore. And it's unfortunate, but we do know that if you give it to people, they will come. Brock Lesnar proves that. To a degree, Lashley has proven it. If you put those guys front and center, they will attract people. If you let them do what they do, they will attract people. It's all about letting them do what they do. Wrestling needs to get away from whatever the fuck Hollywood is pushing. The Hollywood agenda, where, the men and the women are on equal footing, and everyone's wearing body armor and suits, and they got superpowers and all that dumb shit. They need to get the fuck away from that. Nobody cares about that. We don't want that. We want the 80s badass. We want our new Hulk Hogan, our new Ultimate Warrior, our new Bill Goldberg. That's what we want. Our new Brock Lesnar, even though we can still have the same Brock Lesnar. But until wrestling remembers that, we can talk about creative and all that bullshit. That's just a different thing. But until we get the function of looking the part, walking the part, booking the part like the part is like the part's supposed to be, we're never going to get out of the doldrums. It's going to have to change, But let me know what you guys think. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.